So we really should have that coffee. And he went, oh, okay. So I hadn't heard from him for a little while, so I called back about 6 weeks later and I said, Rex, it really is time for you to have that coffee. So we did. He said, okay, come up the road and we'll have a coffee. So I said, look, mate, I think that my experience at the firm has been like this. Yours might be like that. You don't have to confirm that, but we'd really like you to join us. And so I gave him a letter, totally unprompted. He went, okay. And a couple of days later, he'd signed up to come across to the firm. And it was the singular thing that has made the most difference to our business. It really is. Firstly, it contributed to giving us the confidence that we were doing what we were doing in a good way, with enough quality and credibility for somebody of Rex's stature to join us. And at a personal level, because he was somebody I personally admired, which is a rare thing. I'm a hard judge, I'll admit. I was just so pleased that he'd agreed to come across. And then when he turned up, people said to me, well, how did you work with Rex? I said, well, you just give him an office and a great team and leave him to it. Like, I didn't have to do anything in particular. Just tried to make sure he was happy and that he booked his holidays and had a holiday. And because he hadn't been a known holidayer. And look, everything has worked out really well. I know it's worked out well for the people, the young people within the firm that he's worked with. I know it's worked out well for the clients, which is why so many of you are here tonight. And it certainly has worked out so well for the other partners in terms of being a great mentor to all of us. So I'm a bit sad tonight. But I do want to say thank you.
Al Jolson used to say, you ain't heard nothing yet. No, I don't. I've waited 50 years for this night, actually. It was a bit like, my dear friend Gough Whitlam, a few weeks ago. He waited 94 years and he missed the final speech. Brett, thank you very much for what you said tonight. I mean, it's joining Kelly+Partners in June 2007 gave me a real, I was then in my early middle 60s and probably trying to retire, but not having much success. And I guess myself and my staff joining Kelly+Partners really was a great fillip actually to me, and it's given me a few more years. Well, now 7 more years. I've been there for 7 years since the merger. Julia's hoping that I'm going to retire, but as you said, that word retirement is not a word that's used in Kelly+Partners, so we'll see anyway, we'll see. As long as I can keep my office for a little bit longer, Brett, actually. Although somebody said this afternoon, was it Wayne Flanagan or David Weeks said that he heard that the removals had moved in already, and they're making the office smaller. Anyway, I would like to personalise tonight, guys, and I might take up some time actually, but having waited 50 years, I guess, from day one to tonight, I'd like just to talk about my career as a chartered accountant in Sydney. So it's a bit of a Mike Munro, this is your life, but I'm not going to wheel out people because all those that I wanted to be wheeled out are all here and they're all sitting down. So 65 was the year that I joined Coopers and Lybrand. I mean, that was, I'd wasted a couple of years at university and then my father got very sick and I had to leave university. So I said to my uncle, look, I would like to become an accountant. He said, you know what an accountant does? I said, I've got no idea. He said, well, Rex, he said, you've told me that when you were at boarding school at Review, and in those days the Financial Review was published only on a Thursday. He said, I can recall you say to me that when you come home from boarding school on the Sunday, you'd get the Financial Review that your father had bought, you take it back to school on the Sunday night, and you had to get permission to keep the paper at the school. The Jesuits, of course, in those days probably were a bit nervous about this left-wing publication. And that should have been an indication to probably my parents and to me that I was bent upon a business style course, accounting course maybe, and anyway. So when I left university, I again spoke to my uncle in Newcastle, and his grandson is here tonight, Mike Daniel. You know who I'm talking about. And he said, Rex, you must start having some interviews. So I did the old, in those days, I applied through the press, and my first interview was Stephen, you better take note of this actually, it was the Price Waterhouse. And it was in January in that year, in 65, and I can remember today, as though it happened yesterday, the man that interviewed me, I walked into his little office, and it was during the test series somewhere in Australia, and he was an Englishman, and he was the HR director. And he said, Rex, sit down. In those days we had little transistor radios. He put the transistor radio off and plugged it into his ear. So for the whole interview, I had this man talking to me, and he was listening to the cricket. And he'd say, Rex, hold, great shot, all the way through the interview. So that was my introduction to an HR director at Price Waterhouse. I thought, oh, this is terrible. I then went to my, that same day in the city, I went to my dentist in Macquarie Street, and I said, Max Halliday, this has been the story. I've been through a terrible interview at Price Waterhouse. What do I do? He said, Rex, leave it to me. Picked up the phone, he rang up, and I said on the phone, John, this is Max Halliday speaking. I've got a young person here that wants to become an accountant. Can you see him? Good. When? Half an hour. Good. I'll send him over. So he sent me over to a person called John Harrowell, Glassford and something. And he was the future president of the Institute, actually. Wonderful man. Went to see John Harrowell, and he said, Rex, this story's getting a bit long, I trust. He said, Rex, we can't put you on a position, we're a small firm, but I know somebody that I'm sure will have room for you. Got to the phone, can I speak to Jim Jamison, please? And I didn't even know he was ringing, what the firm was. Jim, it's John here. I've got a young man in front of me that wants to become an accountant, he's desperate. Will you see him? No. Okay, I'll send him over. Hung up. And I went over, he said, it's Coopers and Library and over in O'Connell Street. It's now Rex, it's Mr. Jamison. Mr. Jamison. Went over there, not knowing who Mr. Jamison was, who the firm was, etc. Anyway, the interview began, and he didn't have a transistor radio, but he had this man who was the secretary of the partnership at the time, Jeff Jaunton Smith, who some of the old Coopers guys might remember actually. He sat behind me, and Mr. Jamison sat in front of me, and they asked alternate questions. So I was forever spinning around like, this is unbelievable. These bloody accountants, you know, one listens to the transistor radio over the cricket, and now they're putting through an inquisition of questions from the front and from the back. But his first question was, and I'll never forget it, he said, Rex, you're keen on becoming an accountant. Can I ask you a very serious question? What time do you get home from parties? Well, I was floored. I didn't. So I had to think very quickly. I thought, Mr. Jamison, I said, generally about 1 o'clock. That's good, as long as you get home. He said, we'll put you. So there you are. And he said, look, he said, it's unusual to meet a young person that wants to become an accountant so keenly. So we'll put you on. So I started in 65 with Coopers and Library, and I was very lucky actually that I worked with people I had 10 years at Coopers actually, and it was a wonderful family. And as I said, I worked with people that the group that I was working with, I think out of about 8 on the group, they all became partners, except me. They all became partners. I worked under Paul Isherwood in his first 2 years back from England. He was chairman for 9 years. Jamison became president of the Institute, Michael Sharp, president of the Institute, David Smithers, president of the Institute, Paul Isherwood, chairman, and of course Paul Biancardi. So I had a great run there. I was trained by very good people, and I was very lucky actually, very lucky indeed. And I was doing good work on business services, liquidations with Jim Jamison. We did Mainline, we did Kelly+Partners. These were big scandals in those 60s and 70s, and offered us young trainee accountants a lot of experience. In some ways I was trained in a pretty hard school. I had a manager called Peter Darnell, who's he became a partner of course, and my first job, when I went to the office on a Monday morning, they said, Rex, you're going out to a place called Ream Hot Water Service at Rydalmere. I'd never heard of Ream, I'd never heard of Rydalmere. He said, you better get a train and walk from the station. No cabs, train and walk to the client. But tomorrow your manager you can organise a trip. So I went out there. The manager was out there. His name was Philip Long, and he was an Englishman. I don't know whether these guys remember him. He used to have an old Wolseley 444, and he lived at Burwood. I lived at Mossman. I had to be at Burwood Station at 7:45 in the morning from Mossman without a car. I was leaving home at 6 a.m. in the morning to get to Burwood Bay to 7:45. We'd drive out to Rydalmere, we'd work out there, and on the way home, because he had this very old English car, he would stop at a different service station each night. He would check the oil and the tyres. And that would take him 25 minutes, half an hour. I was getting back to the village station about 7:15 at night time. I had to then go home and try and study. I mean, it was a nightmare. Anyway, I did survive. Ream hot water service, Graham. They were a good client. That's where I met Bob Cadwallader, actually. That was a very funny meeting. I then left in 1976, left after 10 years or so. I decided I wanted to go into practice. My father said that if you've got a profession, that one of the big advantages of a profession is that if you want it, you can go out by yourself and work for yourself. So I made the decision in 1976 to go out into practice. Julie and I had only been married a year, and Julie was in second year university. I was a bit older, by the way. So what it meant was that Julie was a full-time student, and I was I began practice. I had one client who was a Cooper's client. He said to me, Rex, if you ever leave the firm, I'll follow you. His name was Vince Hyland. He was worth about $3,000 a year. So I had one client, $3,000 a year. That doesn't go very far. He, in fact, he died recently, but now I look after his son and his grandson. So it's gone through 3 generations, actually, which I'm very proud of. Anyway, $3,000 a year client wasn't very much. So I worked with a fellow called Bob Jones in Paddington, and in those days, Paddington was the scene of Sydney's social life and the long lunches and that. Well, he was a big long lunch man. You know, Brett, he had a fantastic practice, high-profile people. He was a shocking practice manager. He would have been the ideal person for you, today. He would have been ideal. I mean, you would have walked in, taken over the admin, etc., and just made him a fortune. But anyway, when he said to me, Rex, you can work for me, but I can't pay you. I said, Bob, we will have to work something out. He said, well, look, I'll give you a client, and you can keep that client, and that'll compensate you for the fees. So effectively, he gave me a new client every week. And I remember I did the Antique Centre in Darling Street. I'm sure you've all been there, actually. And there was a crazy guy from New York that ran that Antique Centre. We had architects and all the clients were based in the area of Paddington, Woollahra, and they were a pretty wild crowd, actually. The long lunch was the Bellevue Hotel every day. Not me, because I had no money. I mean, I had a full-time student as Julie then, because Julie, I think in those days you could apply for, if you could prove that your income was virtually nil, the husband or the spouse, and your wife was a student, you could apply for a special allowance.
You were my dependent.
Sorry, I was Julie. Because Julie was doing part-time work at the Seaboard Townhouse, and I was working, not earning very much. I remember because in those days, accountants here will appreciate that in those days taxation was a very sort of personalised thing, that if you lodged your return and you made a mistake, they came back to you and talked to you and whatever else. I lodged a return, it must have been in 1977, and I got a letter from the tax office about 6 months later saying, Dear Mr. Hoeben, in reference to your tax return for last year, we are very concerned as to how you are living. And they then proceeded to ask me all these questions about, household expenses and whatever else. Well, I wrote back to them. They must have had tears in their eyes because I had no income. We had a little minivan, and I said my wife is a full-time student. She's working and being paid for more hours than I am. Anyway, it worked, and they never came back to me again. I wish I'd framed that letter, actually. Yeah. So then, because times move on, I guess every client in those days was very important, even the little clients. And Paul Biancardi referred a client to me, an ex-employee of Coopers and Lybrand, and he had the group certificate. He was probably $100 a year. What Paul and I weren't aware of, that he married into the Fairfax family. Well, let me tell you, from $100, he was a real trick, actually. He said to me, and something I've never forgotten, he said to me, Rex, ethics is a place in England. I've never forgotten that. He had no ethics. Yeah. Anyway, he was very good to me, and he had a little Sydney practice, but they were all butchers and they were tradies up in the northern beaches. So he gave me all these butchers to look after. Well, it was great for the family. Julie was still a full-time student. I was earning no money, so we used to do contras on meat. Thank God Julie wasn't a vegetarian. Yeah, it was very, very, very funny then. And then an old friend called Gray Hughes joined me, and we had a couple of years in partnership, and then he got sick and left me. But when he left me to go to hospital or he was illness, he left me all of his clients. So there I was lucky. I had my little practice that I built up, and then I had Gray Hughes' practice that he gave me. That worked for a couple of years, but just got too busy. And then through a tax discussion group in the North Shore, I met Keith Pritchard and Leslie Adams. She was a woman, and they had a practice in Chatswood, and I knew Leslie Adams through the tax discussion group, and they said, Rex, we're sort of planning our retirement. They were quite young, actually. Would you consider buying us out or merging with us? But you can't do it by yourself. You must have somebody to come in with you. And I approached my old friend and colleague Peter Cronin at Coopers and Lybrand. He was still there. I knew he wanted to go into practice. So he and I made an offer, and then we bought out Pritchard Adams, I think in about 1985. It was quite funny, Brett, that on the handover of the cheques on the settlement, we went into Stuyvesant House in Crow's Nest and handed the cheques over. Peter and I paid for lunch. Keith Pritchard stayed on as a consultant at no money at all to bed all the clients down for 4 years. Leslie Adams, we never saw her again. And then she started approaching the clients that sold to me. So, some bad memories. Anyway, fast forwarding 20 years, June 2007, my age was progressing and I was trying to plan my retirement. And I was advising a friend, it's a very small world. I was asked to advise a friend of mine, an acquaintance more than a friend, who was considering merging with a practice in North Sydney. Robert, anyway, I said, Robert, who are you talking to? He said, I'm talking to Brett Kelly in North Sydney. I said, Brett used to work for us a couple of years ago. So you're thinking of merging, are you? Yeah. Could you just drop a little hint that maybe you might have a little chat to me? So straight away, of course, he had a little chat to Brett, because Brett was on the phone in the morning, at lunchtime, afternoon. He harassed me. And after a number of minutes, we met in the Grace Hotel on the ground floor, Brett, for coffee, and we shook hands. And that would have been in late May 2007. I told my partners what was happening. They were a bit upset about it, but the firm dissolved amicably, and we all went our separate directions. And on July the 1st, 2007, I joined Kelly+Partners. I brought over my PA, a strata team who were mostly students, Joel Russell and Graham Wren and Sandy Merrick. Now Sandy Merrick is still with us. Joel is manager of the strata division, and so is Graham. So they've all survived the 7 years. But remember, I didn't quite know the size of Brett's practice. He talked it up big, of course, but I soon discovered that on day one, that it was Brett and Ada and Craig and little Joycey, the human dynamo. 4 people. So I was bringing over about 10 people to join a smaller practice than us, half the size. I was a little bit worried, actually. And then Brett said to me, I said, I'm a bit of a control freak, Rex, I'll show you my files. No, here we go. He said, I've got a yellow file for this, a red file for that, a green file for that. These are all sort of semi-client files. Also, he said, Rex, I'm going to give you a reading list. Here's a list of 10 books we have. Now, I want you to read 1 book a week, 1 book a month, I should say. And whenever we have staff training, I'll be asking questions about your impressions of the books. I said, Rex, for God's sake, what have I come into? I was very worried. Anyway, we all survived. We all survived, and I guess things got better and better, mainly because of, the support of Craig and Ada particularly, but they also gave me this little human domino, Joyce Howe. A client told me some years later that Rexy said she's the sort of person that when I'm giving her a tax problem, he said she's emailing me the answer. He said it's a bit disconcerting. He said she's always ahead of me, Anyway, she was very. But Joycey was fan. And because later on I had Charbel. Where is Charbel, by the way? I had Charbel, who is now a partner at Penrith, and also Andrew Zogby too, and a lot of support. And then of course Stephen Bowles joined Kelly+Partners in North Sydney, and Stephen and I had a long association with PwC. I was the auditor of one of their external companies, and Stephen was the CFO, and I had to present myself with the figures every year, and Stephen made sure that he put me through the hoops, actually, as they always did. Also, but over these years I have a lot to thank for, and that's the loyalty of clients. Stan Brogan from Pricewaterhouse can't be here tonight, but he in fact referred a client to me, probably in 1979, Travel Plan. And they're still a client of the firm, some 35 years later. And David can go, I'm so glad that you've been able to come tonight. And John Lufton, where's John? John, the 3 of them from Travel Plan, you've been very long, loyal clients. David and Deirdre Kitchen. David, you go back to day one. David was with Hamilton and Co. The breakup after Bob Hamilton went to Mirvac. David and the whole group came to me as independent real estate agents. And David and his former partners, Roger Pickup, are still with me after 35 years. I'm very, very grateful. Rick and Sue Butler. Rick is an architect on the North Shore. We met about the same time at a Sunday barbecue. Rick, and we're still together. We've had a few ups and downs, but not very many really, have we? All up, yeah. Jill and David Weeks. David, you've been very loyal to me, David. I've held your hand a few times, as Jill knows, his wife. You know, he takes a bit of hand holding, David, but anyway, we're getting through it. And also Peter Helm too. Now, I don't know where Peter is. Peter Helm is also a client going back 35 years. So I've been very, very lucky. I've also been very lucky that after the merger of Pritchard Adams and Kelly+Partners, I had a sizable, I thought, what's called strata division, strata audit division, where we go out and audit strata plans. I'd just like to quote some figures to you guys. That 7 years later, we are now lodging 11,000 strata plan tax returns. That's 11,000 blocks. We are auditing over 4,000 blocks, full audit, and we're doing BAS returns for about 6,000 strata plans. So it's become a giant business actually, and a business that my partner Peter Dawkins and I'm very proud of. I was fortunate that I'd been at Kelly+Partners for 2 years, and Brett said, you know, Rex, he said, your biggest competitor is a firm called Griffiths Forrest and Greer. Let's go and get them. Anyway, because they were my biggest competitor and they were bigger than I was. Well, Brett too is, in typical fashion, rang the firm, approached them, made an offer, and merged within a month or so. Unfortunately, Peter Dawkins ran their strata division, so Peter and I have been, side-by-side partners, adjoining offices, and had a lot of fun. And we really, in fact, I'm very, very proud, Peter, of what's that strata division. We're the biggest division within the firm. I guess over all these years, one has to remember that if you come from a good family, a happy family, it makes it a lot easier. And Julie has been a great support to me all the way through, as my sons have too. I mean, they know the hours that you put in to try and not cut into the hours on weekends of children when they're growing up. I used to go into the office at 6 a.m. on a Sunday morning, but I'll be home by 9 o'clock when they were sort of waking up and having breakfast, whatever. So that was a bit of a hard slog, Sam and John, but it was done. And Julie, of course, was running her own business. I mean, she was building up, the largest orthopaedic shoe retailer in Australia. So she wasn't just looking after me and 3 children, but also building up a business of quite a considerable size. So I've been very lucky that I've been supported all the way through by my family. So there you are, guys. Had a lot of support from Julie, the boys, my family, my missing daughter in New York, who in fact was a strata auditor. Wasn't she, Brett, a couple of years ago? Now, Brett, now you can't afford her, I'm sorry. She's earning far too much money. It's been a wonderful ride, actually, guys. When I look around, some of them say, Bob Witt particularly, when you say that when you retire, I'm going to retire too. Don't, Bob. I'll still be around for a bit longer. Graham, I'll still be here for a bit longer, But it's been a great ride, guys. 50 years of being an accountant. Thank you all very much.
Now, Rex, we don't go. We do have something for you.
Right, a Rolex watch.
Oh.
I've always wanted a Rolex watch.
Wanted a gold Rolex watch.
I've always did.
We told him we only give that to people when they retire. Where's that little prize we've got?
A little prize.
A particularly beautiful work of art.
Oh.
And,
is that a Whiteley or is that a
look at it.
Sydney Nolan or is that a Whiteley? Is it?
It's an abstract rendition of Rexy.
Oh, for God's sake. Where's that going to go?
So what we've done for Rexy, just in case he forgets as he gets older, January 1965.
Oh, all the dates.
We've recounted these dates.
Oh, for
his
God's
finest
sake.
achievements, at least at work. I do, before I present this to Rex, I do want to in particularly thank Julie. Julie's been an excellent partner at Kelly+Partners and has been so great to have around, and I know that she has supported Rex so well. The one date that we don't have on here which really is, and I think everyone here knows, Rexy's finest achievement was marrying his child bride. We haven't put that on here, but I really want to thank Julie. I want to thank Rex so much. Julie, do you want to come up here, because we really want to get a photo of you two together? And I want to give you this, Rexy.
It's not an island.
No, look at it. Look at it.
How many years ago was that taken?
Oh,
Yesterday.
Yesterday.
That's the original.
Yesterday.
So, have you got the camera there, Manny? Do you want to grab a photo of the guys?
Hold this up. Oh, isn't that lovely? Beautiful.
Thank you.
Oh, Sam and John.
Jump up, boys.
Well
Yeah,
played,
photo.
comrade.